would begin with what I think is one of the most striking, I suppose, examples of devotion we see in the whole of Scripture. And I think it's the woman with the alabaster box. For those who don't know it, it's a woman who boldly approaches Jesus, has expensive perfume, pours it at Jesus' feet, and it's met with outrage. People are like, yo, whoa, that's a very expensive perfume. Don't waste it. What are you doing? Even the disciples who should have known better, they said, it don't take that much. You're wasting perfume here. Because she loved God and she loved Jesus so much, it didn't matter the cost. She poured out the perfume. She lavished his feet. And even though we don't know much about her and her story, we know her based on what she was devoted to. Her devotion led Jesus to say, you're going to be part of the gospel message for all eternity because of what you've done here today. It's visual. I mean, imagine a woman crying, pouring expensive perfume out. So that's where I want to begin today, devotion. The first thing I remember being devoted to is probably music, right? Some don't know, but I am a musician. That was my first love. And I remember being young and just sort of discovering YouTube. I would be up all night watching YouTube on my iPod Touch, listening to songs, deep cuts. I was a jazz guy, so I would be listening to deep cuts, videos with like 20 views, and I would watch it day in, day out. I would go on to study music. I would be at shows, and I loved music so much. That's the first thing I remember really loving and being like, wow, this is me, this is who I am. That was my devotion. If you tapped me on the shoulder at that age and said, Mike, what are you devoted to? I would have told you music. That's it. Music. It's all I want to think about. It's all I want to talk about. And so 2 questions for us before we carry on. 1, what are you devoted to? And 2, what is the object of your affection? At some stage in my life, it was music. I love music. I still consider myself a musician. But the devotions changed a bit. Now, I'm no Paul, but we went through a similar experience. And I suspect some of you in here probably went through a similar experience in that you might have been devoted to something, but now you find yourself at a leadership conference thinking about how you can love God more, pour yourself out for God. So somehow your devotion, I hope too, has changed. Now let's zoom into the scripture. So if you have Bibles, let's open to Philippians. Let's look at 2. Because Paul here is in an interesting situation in that his devotion, rather than being met with, oh, beautiful, has actually led him into trouble. Paul's devotion has landed him in a Philippian jail, right? His passion has gotten him in trouble, and now he faces death, right? It's one of the many times Paul would be imprisoned. He's in prison because of trumped up charges. Saul, in the book of Acts 9, Saul actually converts, right? He was once known for persecuting the church, was there at Stephen's death. People were laying clothes before his feet and praising him. He switches his name, he switches his allegiance from being a great persecutor of the church. He writes a letter to the disciples saying, I would like to join what you're doing. Immediately, the Jews say, we need to kill him. So literally, he just switches sides and they're like, yeah, we need you dead, as it were. And so you've got this sort of, I guess, group of people who hate his guts and his newfound love of Jesus. His decision to step fully into ministry has gotten people wanting him dead. They throw him in jail and his end is coming. Spoiler alert, he does die. Sure, we all know that, but he does die in the end. It's important to note, though, that Paul is in this Philippian jail, and it may look like things aren't going well. In fact, if you go to certain churches, they will tell you, this is the enemy. He's in jail. How does service to God lead you to jail? How does pouring out your life to God lead you in a place where you're facing death and there's people lying on your name? It doesn't seem to make sense. But consider this, even though Paul is in this Philippian jail, God chose Paul. God orchestrated everything in his life such that him sitting in that jail was an act of God's divine providence. Why is this important? God chose you. If you're in this room, you have been chosen by God. First, to be a son, to be adopted, to be part of his family, then to be vessels of honor. Folks that God has chosen to serve him in the area of ministry. Quick aside or sidebar, ministry simply means to serve. The Greek word is diakonia. It means to be of service. So whilst we have formal ministry in the case of sort of pastoring and things of that nature, we all can also be called into non-formal ministry, which is to live in service of other people. And whilst you may be like, I'm not a pastor, I just have a TikTok channel. You're like, I'm not a pastor, I just run a YouTube channel, I run a Instagram blog. Doesn't matter. If you live in service to other people and you're doing it to the glory and for the glory of God, for all intents and purposes, you are ministering to people. Whether it's a group of friends, whether it's 2 kids in your local church, whether it's the whole youth group, we're all called, if we're in this room, to ministry in that way. How do I know? Well, guys, it's a Friday morning. You could literally be doing anything, but somehow you're sat in the church talking about leadership and Christian ministry. God chose you, my brothers and sisters. You've been chosen by God. He's drawn you through his irresistible grace, and now here you are, sat in this room. I know you've been chosen because many people see the same issues in the world but aren't moved. And you may know this just anecdotally. It happens all the time where I'm with a friend and we spot something's wrong. Maybe we're complaining about something. And they go, yeah, that thing's such a mess. And they just change the subject. And I'm like, whoa. But why don't we do something about it? And they're just like, it's not I don't care. But somehow, it's in my head, just, we need to do something about it. We need to fix this. And you may have the similar experience where you just can't look at suffering. You just can't look at things not being done the way they should be done. You can't look at people in pain. You can't look at people not knowing Jesus and feel something. That is the only clue you need. When I sit with people that am I called into ministry, I say, do you care? They go, yeah, I deeply care. I'm like, then you're called. It's that simple for me. The sense of injustice you may have in your heart, the sense of pain that you may have when you see someone wandering, the desire you have to serve, to make life better for other people, all of these are clues that just like Saul, God has called you. And that's why you're here. Now, what was Paul's great crime? Can I get some water if that's okay? I think I have like 2% water left before I faint. Paul's great crime was he preached the gospel. His great crime was that he traveled around telling people who Jesus was. His great crime was that he preached this radical message, which was genuinely radical, which is Christ crucified and him raised from the dead. It's the same message that Stephen, that he watched die. It's the same message that Stephen preached. And God in his cosmic irony would have Paul in the same position that he saw Stephen in and looked on gladly. It's from this context that Paul pens these words. Even as I am being poured out like a drink offering, still I rejoice and I am glad with you. I mean, consider that. He's facing sure annihilation. And he writes about 1, being poured out like a drink offering. But as Sam said, 2, he's glad. And he says, I rejoice with you. It doesn't make sense. What does he mean? Let's take a close look. Philippians 2. Have we got it up? Have we got it up? Good. I haven't, so just buying time. Everyone there? All right, here we go. Philippians 2. So prior to the Philippians 2:17, Paul's been talking about a bunch of different things. He's writing a letter to the church in Philippi. He's talking about what it means to live like Jesus Christ, what it looks to be like him. In chapter 1, he had already spoken about what it means to live in view of Christ. So he talks about that famous scripture, to live as Christ, to die as gain, that came in Philippians 1. Thank you so much. So he's already been talking about these issues. And so we reach our zenith, our peroration in verse 17. And that's what he says. Yes, and I am being poured out as a drink offering on sacrifice. I'm reading the NKJV. And service of your faith. I am glad and I rejoice with you all. What does he mean by this? Well, let's take a closer look. First, he says poured out. What does it mean to be poured out? Paul is saying, in this jail, I am being expended. Honestly, the thought that came to my mind, anyone ever play Burnout here? PS2, anyone? Wow, tough crowd. No Burnout fans from PS2. Remember when the car would crash and burn and it would say, wasted?
Oh, I know that.
Yes, exactly. We have a believer in the room. Good. Wasted. This is what Paul is saying here. I've been wasted. I've been expended, right? I've been drained. He's given us a picture of sacrifice. I've been totally used by God. It's a picture of being consumed by something. It's a picture of being so sort of consumed that you cease to exist because you've so given yourself over to something. So Paul says, I am being poured out. Second key thing to pay attention to, he says, like a drink offering. So he makes a simile, like. But what is a drink offering? Well, many of us may know that, at least in the Old Testament, most notably Numbers, there's different types of offerings, right? You've got a burnt offering, which typically is an animal that's burnt up, a bird, a ram, a bull, a goat. They are burnt up, and pagans used to believe that the food was actually feeding their gods. So as they burnt up the ram, the idea is that the god would eat it, right? Which is ridiculous, but such is life. You have a peace offering. Remember that this is in the New Testament, Romans, we learn about us being justified and no longer being at at war with God. That's a peace offering, justification. But then you had a burnt offering, a drink offering. And a drink offering would be a drink, typically wine, that's basically poured on the burnt offering. And the idea is that it exacerbates it so the aromas rise up even further. Pagans used to actually pour the drink offering on the burnt offering. But Israelites would pour it around. Don't know why you need that detail, but it's always fun to know some of these things, right? So the drink offering wasn't the main offering. It was added to the burnt offering, right? To kind of exacerbate or accentuate, if you like, the offering in and of itself. So the drink offering was in many ways a second offering. Why is this important? So why is this important? Paul is writing to the church in Philippi, and he's saying, you guys, the life you're living now, the life you're living consumed by God, the life you're living being poured out by God, that's the right life. My life is like a drink offering to that. So as you're living a life of sacrifice, my life is like oil, it's like wine that's being poured on your sacrifice, and my sacrifice is intermingling with your sacrifice, and together that shared sacrifice is what we're offering up to God. That's the point he's trying to make there. So he's saying, I'm not alone. I'm in jail. They stripped me of the relationship I have with you, but I'm not alone. Even in here, my sacrifice is a drink offering. And brothers and sisters, have you ever felt sometimes like the sacrifice you're doing is not being noticed, is somehow, you're making concessions here, you're staying late to mentor that young person, or you're giving money to this ministry, and it feels like you're being left alone. But Paul's encouragement here is, even if you find yourself in jail, I know we have a jail break right now, right? Maybe you might wonder, and we can hand them over to the authorities, to the glory of God. Anyways, even if you find yourself in jail, your sacrifice isn't alone. It's part of this large group of other sacrifices that believers make. He's saying, my sacrifice is being added to yours. And then he says in the last part, if you're going to underline something, glad and rejoice. How does all this talk of sacrifice lead you to be glad and to rejoice? How does all this talk of being in pain and being wrongfully accused? You only have to play Villagers of Mafia once to see what it feels like to be wrongfully accused. You know, I feel the righteousness that comes out of me when someone says you're a mafia and I'm like, I'm a villager. It shows you how much righteous indignation sometimes you can have. But even in the face of accusations, Paul says, I'm glad and I rejoice. Why? Because, and this is important, Paul knows that for a believer, death is not the end. So even though he faces short annihilation, he's like, death isn't the end. And as such, I know I'm going somewhere better. And that can sound like something nice we say here and there, but he genuinely believed this. How do we know? Because a few verses earlier, he said to live as Christ, to die as gain. So, who knew that he would actually have to prove that by actually dying? By the way, not really a joke, but something to notice, Paul would end up being beheaded, and so he actually would become a drink offering because the blood would trickle out from his, that's a bit gory, but you get the gist. He actually would be a drink offering. He wasn't just speaking metaphorically. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. He knows that his life isn't going to be wasted. And this is the encouragement. As we all here serve in various capacities, some of us run pages, some of us are in church, some of us work in offices, some of us have been called to marketplaces, so we're in our jobs. Even all those things, your life is not wasted. Your leadership isn't wasted. Your sacrifices, they're not wasted. You can be glad and rejoice in knowing that it's been added to something far more. You are a small part of something big and amazing and meaningful. Hey there, sorry to disrupt you watching that video. I just want to ask one favor from you. We are trying to get to 10,000 subscribers, and you can help us out by just hitting the subscribe button. Do it right now and enjoy the rest of the episode. The third reason Paul is glad and rejoices is because he knows he's following in the footsteps of the man of sorrows. He is following in the footsteps of Jesus himself. I could proof text that a few verses earlier. He talks about Jesus, who also suffered, right? Who also was killed. He also was wrongfully accused. So why not him? So, as I bring this to a close, this is meant to be a short sort of like few thoughts to consider. What can we learn from Paul in this portion of scripture? What does Paul have to tell us about a life poured out that we can really grapple with at this start? One, be an offering. To be a leader in any capacity is to be an offering. In Romans 12:2, we know this. He says, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. So he says, if you want to lead, you have to offer yourself up. There is nothing. I mean, we did a podcast once when someone says, should I go into part-time ministry? That doesn't exist. There is nothing such as part-time ministry. It's full-time. You're an offering. What's part-time? Offer your hand? Like, but keep the other hand? No. You're in full-time ministry. Whether you're paid to do something or not, you're in full-time ministry. Why? Because you're giving yourself over as a living sacrifice to God's use. So be consumed by ministry. It reminds me a bit of sort of 1 Corinthians, I think it's 16, the house of Stephanos. I don't know if anyone knows that story. There's a household of faith that said that it's the only time the word addiction is mentioned in the Bible. And the only time it's mentioned is this house who apparently were addicted to service. Which is such an interesting, I just found it quite funny. They were addicted to service. They were consumed by service. Right? You can study them. It's quite interesting. 1 Corinthians 16, I think. So, be consumed. Be an offering. The second thing is, and this is something I was trying to work out yesterday with a brother of mine. We were sitting down talking about this. And I was saying, I think as leaders, and most of you in this room, I think, will probably fit into this, you probably have this insatiable appetite. You probably discern now that you have an appetite. And I just don't think anything can really satiate that appetite. I think you can try lots of different things, But as a leader, I don't think anything really satiates that appetite. I think the only thing that can satiate the appetite that God put inside of you is ministry. It's the only thing big enough, capacious enough, dynamic enough that will actually maybe feel like, okay, this is it. Because everything else just feels like it's scratching the urge. Business is like sort of getting there. Maybe you do a run and you're really expended and it's sort of getting there. But here's the thing I've discovered. I think everything else that you put in place of what God has called you to do will crumble under the weight of the expectation you place on it, because it's just not enough. I think ministry, being consumed by God, being used by Him, genuinely satiates that appetite. Anything else is just a cheap imitation that will scratch the itch for a while, but won't really get there. Do you know what I mean? Like get there. And so, your appetite has been put in by God, and I think is best satiated when you offer yourself to Him as a genuine living sacrifice. Everything else will cave in on itself when you put your appetite on it, because it's not designed to hold your appetite. Your appetite is ginormous. Your appetite is great. That's why you're here at 9 a.m. when you could be doing lots of other things. That's why you're even considering yourself. I mean, with all the scandals we've seen in the church, the fact that people still even want to be in leadership already means you're either called by God or something's deeply wrong. Now, I think you're called by God. So we can leave the other angle, but that itself should inspire you, I suppose. Okay, I should wrap up. All right? Got you. So we can do some questions or whatever. Here's the last thing we can learn from Paul. The best life is the poured out life. The best life is the poured out life. Through the pain, through the suffering, through the depths of not feeling appreciated, feeling like things aren't going the way you want it to go, all of that just echoes a weight of glory that's going to be revealed. And so it takes faith, and I thought how to end this, because I thought, well, there are some benefits from leadership that I could talk about, but if I'm honest with you, if I'm brutally honest, and I think this is the place to be brutally honest, we're all leaders. I don't think the earthly pros outweigh the earthly cons. Breaking news. I don't think so. So if I was meant to a younger brother of mine, I wouldn't inspire him by saying that, do it. It's going to be hard, but there's going to be so many good things, and the good is really outweighs the bad. I genuinely don't think that. I think the pain just echoes the weight of glory that's going to be revealed. I think there's a big part of the puzzle that we can't kind of lay claim to on this side of eternity. And so, Paul, in inspiring leaders, says, to live as Christ, to die as gain. The gain is yet to come. The great gain is yet to be laid claim to. Now, we'll tease all these things out. There are probably some questions now that we can maybe tackle. But we'll tease it out this whole, these next 2 days. What I sought to do is just show us a tiny bit about, Paul, a bit about what he means by drink offering and things like that, but also to get us thinking deeper about what would possess him to pen these words. Why is this the advice he gives us at this zenith peroration moment of his ministry? And I hope we're blessed as we study and search the scriptures to make greater sense of these things. Lots of seminars coming up, lots of things that we can go through that I hope will help us. But let's make way for maybe 1 or 2 questions or something like that, and then we'll go to the next section. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, MT. Pleasure of people. Okay, so as we said, to try and keep this interactive, any questions from anyone in the audience? And also mention your name as well. So
my question is to where you talk about being offered. Now, a lot of us say about balancing our careers whilst in ministry. How can we fully offer ourselves and we talk to people if we also have to be committed to our careers?
Yeah. Did we all get that? So it says if you're, a lot of people here and a lot of people that will join us later on are working full time or they've got jobs. So how do you do that? A large part of it, I think, is rethinking what ministry means. So as I've said before, sometimes I think we think ministry is sort of, it's what you're paid to do when you work in church. So if you're working in church full time, then that's when you're in full time ministry. Whereas the way to really think about it, I think, is to change the identity marker. We said before, ministry means to serve, right? That's broadly what it means. If you're a leader, irrespective of what domain you find yourself, you're still the same person. If you're a pastor, you're not only a pastor in your church, even in different settings, there'll still be opportunities to display that pastoral call you have, that call to tend to people, to care for people, to watch over people. That's still going to be there. So even at work, your prayer should be, God, even at work, reveal to me opportunities to serve people. That's if you're going to do sort of part-time work and part-time work in a vocational ministry for a long time. But at some stage, even if you're a full-time pastor, say, well, your working hours still end, right? But do you then stop being a pastor at 6 p.m.? Of course not. Of course, you know how life works. There's all sorts of things that crop up and issues and problems. So we've got to stop dividing our lives almost based on the kind of hours of work we're given, or the hours of play we're given, and instead, we're principally sons. That's the first things. We're adopted, we're sons. Before you're a pastor, you're a speaker, you're first a son, right? And there are no, people say sons, daughters, no, you're sons. Just like we're all the bride of Christ, right? So it balances out. I don't have any issues with being the bride. I'm like, I'm the groom of Christ. It's like, no, I'm part of the bride, just like everyone's a son. So we're adopted, that's the first thing. And that will never change. Whether you preach, you lay hands, you prophesy, you are a son. That will never change. After being a son, and you now discovered some of the spiritual giftings God has given you, and you start to walk in that, you walk in that wherever you are. Wherever you are, you walk in those. If you have the gift of wisdom, I hope you're not only wise during service, right? You're wise at work, as it were. So see yourself principally as a son. Secondly, as whatever vocations, whatever gift God has called you to have, and then display that, diffuse that wherever you are. 2 Corinthians is a good example. It talks about wisdom, right? Diffuse the fragrance of God's wisdom wherever you go. Just diffuse it. Diffuse it. Now, here's the reality, though. At some stage, you might have to make a decision whether doing both is good, or whether you ought to lay sort of, and when I say doing both, I mean sort of working full time in whatever job you're doing, or whether you ought to bite the bullet and just do that. But that's another conversation that requires a few considerations. We'll take one more, and then.
Any more? One more question?
There was one here. Was that the same question? Oh, super, great. Any more? One here, and then that'll be it.
Hi everybody, my name is Garson Sala. My question is, how do you deal with the issue of having too many things that you care about and picking one thing to commit to?
Tough. Difficulty with answering those sort of questions is I want to ask you 3 more questions, right, to really understand what you mean. So I can't speak specifically to that, obviously, without understanding more context. General advice, I'm your typical, I want to do everything. My mum said something once, I don't know if it's wise on purpose or by accident, but here's what she said. She said, if you chase 2 rabbits, how many are you going to catch? I said 1, but she was like, none. And I was like, but you could catch 1. Anyways, I think the wisdom in that is that if your attention is divided, it's very hard to get momentum in one thing if you're doing lots of different things. So what's helped me over time is to always have one sort of major thing that I'm considering, maybe 2, but typically 1, and then to develop something I've spoken about before, which is a God shelf, which are things that you're going to do, but they're just not for right now. But you want to keep them in view. And you still want to sort of satiate the appetite you have for them in some capacity, but it's not the main thing you're doing right now. So for instance, if you know that you've been called into a certain part of the world, and that's very clear, that's where you must go, but you have dependents and kids, you can't just up and leave. So you might be thinking, okay, So I'm working right now. I know I'm meant to be in Cambodia. Okay, how do I just take courses or start? You get the gist. But somehow, Paul is able to have joy in the middle of that. And what we want to figure out the next 2 days is how. How do you have joy whilst pouring yourself out for the Lord? Hey, thank you so much for watching that video and for staying all the way till the end. We are on a journey to 10,000 subscribers. So if you like that video, if you want to see more from us, if you want to support us, do so by clicking the subscribe button. Our mission here is to help you discover Jesus and to equip you to make him known. So keep talking about Jesus and hit the subscribe button.